December 16th, 1944. 0523 hours. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Dawn is still 2 hours away, and the darkness between the trees is absolute, the kind of blackness that swallows sound and makes distances impossible to judge. Private First Class Robert Dalton lies completely motionless beneath 18 inches of forest debris, his body temperature dropping steadily in the pre-dawn cold, his breathing shallow and controlled. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, German forces are massing for what will become the largest German offensive of the war's final year, Operation Wacht am Rhein. The desperate gamble Hitler has staked on breaking through Allied lines and capturing Antwerp. But Dalton doesn't know about grand strategy or operational objectives. He knows only that standard defensive positions have made American soldiers easy targets in this terrain, that a battalion has lost 32 men in the past week to German snipers who operate with devastating effectiveness from concealed positions, and that the forest floor hide he constructed over the past 3 days violates every regulation in the field manual. He also knows that in approximately 40 minutes, when enough ambient light filters through the canopy for targets to become visible, he'll either prove his unconventional position works or die trying. The weight of that calculation presses down harder than the soil and leaves covering his body. Robert Dalton grew up in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York, in country where winter arrived early and stayed late, where the forests were so dense that hunters learned to think three-dimensionally about terrain and approach angles. His father was a fur trapper who worked wilderness areas too remote for casual sportsmen, teaching young Robert that survival in deep woods required thinking like the animals you hunted. By age 12, Dalton could construct ground blinds so seamlessly integrated with their surroundings that deer would walk within feet without detecting human presence. He learned that successful concealment wasn't about hiding behind things, but about becoming part of the landscape, matching not just visual appearance but texture, shadow patterns, and the subtle environmental cues that prey animals use to detect threats. His father taught him that the best hide wasn't the one that looked invisible from a distance, but the one that remained invisible even under direct examination, that required understanding how predators and prey perceive their environment differently, how humans instinctively scan at eye level and above, while largely ignoring ground-level details that don't suggest immediate threat. Dalton absorbed these lessons through thousands of hours in the woods, developing instinct about concealment and positioning that went far deeper than anything taught in hunting magazines or outdoor guides. The Army drafted Dalton in spring 1943, processing him through infantry training at Camp Wheeler, Georgia, where his wilderness skills immediately mark him as different from urban recruits who'd never spent nights outdoors without tents and campfires. His instructors noted his aptitude for fieldcraft and recommended him for scout training, specialized instruction that taught reconnaissance techniques, camouflage discipline, and forward observation skills. Dalton excelled at the technical aspects, but chafed against doctrinal limitations that felt arbitrary to someone who'd learned practical concealment from necessity rather than manuals. Army doctrine emphasized elevated hides for snipers and observers, positions in trees or buildings that provided wide fields of view and multiple escape routes. Ground-level concealment was considered too restrictive, too vulnerable, too limiting for effective observation or engagement. Instructors taught that elevation provided tactical advantage, that height meant safety and effectiveness. Dalton understood the logic, but also recognized its limitations. Elevated positions were predictable. Enemy forces trained to scan Treline's rooftops and high ground. They expected threats from above because that's where doctrine said threats should be, but they walked past ground-level positions without seeing them because nothing in their training suggested threats existed at that level. Dalton kept these observations private, recognizing that questioning doctrine was career-limiting behavior, but he filed a tactical insight away for potential future application. By December 1944, Dalton's unit, attached to the 99th Infantry Division, was holding defensive positions along the Belgian-German border in terrain that negated most American tactical advantages. The Ardennes Forest was ancient, dense, and claustrophobic, with limited roads, poor visibility, and topography that broke units into isolated pockets operating without effective mutual support. American defensive strategy relied on holding key road junctions and villages while using mobile reserves to counterattack any German penetrations. But the strategy assumed adequate early warning of German movements. intelligence that depended on forward observers and reconnaissance elements identifying threats before they achieved tactical surprise. That intelligence network was failing catastrophically. German forces, veterans of Eastern Front fighting who'd learned to operate in forests far denser than the Ardennes, were infiltrating American lines with ease, using terrain and weather to mask movements until they were practically on top of defensive positions. American observers in elevated hides, positioned according to doctrine in tree stands and building upper floors, were being systematically hunted and killed by German counter-snipers who'd learned to identify and engage elevated positions with brutal efficiency. The Americans had lost 8 observers in Dalton's sector alone over 10 days, each killed from concealed positions they never identified. The survivors were increasingly reluctant to occupy forward hides, knowing that standard positions had become death traps. Dalton had been watching this tactical failure develop with growing frustration. The problem wasn't that American observers lacked skill or courage. It was that they were following doctrine that made them predictable and therefore vulnerable. German snipers knew where to look for American observers because they knew American doctrine as well as the Americans themselves. Elevated hides, tree-lean positions, building corners, all the approved locations were also the most obvious. Dalton believed there was a better approach, one his father had taught him years before Army instructors tried to convince him that elevation equaled effectiveness. He believed that a properly constructed ground-level hide, built directly into the forest floor rather than above it, could provide concealment so complete that enemy forces would literally walk past without detection. The tactical advantages were significant. A ground hide eliminated the visual profile that made elevated positions detectable. It provided natural overhead concealment from aerial observation. It offered 360-degree escape options through tunneling rather than relying on exposed climbing or withdrawal routes. And most importantly, it exploited the fundamental human tendency to scan for threats at eye level and above while treating the ground as inert terrain rather than potential threat space. The doctrinal objections to ground hides were numerous and apparently insurmountable. Field manuals specifically prohibited below-ground fighting positions in forward areas, citing vulnerability to artillery, inability to observe and engage effectively, limited fields of fire, and catastrophic risk if the position was discovered and assaulted. Battalion standing orders required all observation posts to maintain multiple clear withdrawal routes and to be positioned for mutual support with adjacent positions. Ground hides violated both requirements. They were isolated, restricted, and would be nearly impossible to reinforce or evacuate if compromised. Company officers, briefed on Dalton's proposal during a particularly contentious planning meeting, rejected it immediately. Sergeant Dalton, "We're not burying our observers alive in foxholes where they can't see, can't shoot, and can't escape if the Germans come through. That's not defensive doctrine. That's suicide with extra steps. Find appropriate elevated positions, or we'll find someone else to run the observation post." Dalton had nodded, accepted the decision, and then spent 3 days building his ground hide anyway. He'd learned in the Army that innovative solutions were rarely approved through proper channels. Sometimes you needed to demonstrate effectiveness first and deal with bureaucratic consequences later. The position Dalton selected was a slight depression roughly 400 yards forward of American main defensive lines, positioned along a likely German approach route identified through pattern analysis of previous infiltration attempts. The depression was perhaps 30 inches deep at its center, barely noticeable to casual observation, but sufficient for Dalton's purposes. He'd spent 3 nights excavating carefully, removing soil one handful at a time and dispersing across a wide area to avoid creating visual signatures that might indicate digging. He'd lined the shallow pit with scavenged waterproof material from destroyed vehicles, creating a moisture barrier that would keep him relatively dry during extended occupancy. He constructed a breathing tube from rolled canvas and wire, positioning it to look like a broken branch stub protruding from the forest floor. Most critically, he'd built a layered overhead concealment system using living vegetation, forest debris, and carefully arranged branches that created a canopy indistinguishable from the surrounding forest floor even under close examination. The hide's interior was barely large enough for Dalton to lie prone with his rifle, a space so constricted it would trigger claustrophobia in most soldiers. But the concealment was extraordinary. From 3 feet away, The position looked like undisturbed forest floor, a slight depression filled with leaf litter and decomposing vegetation that warranted no special attention. Dalton's fields of fire were severely limited compared to elevated positions. He could observe and engage targets in a roughly 90-degree arc along the approach route he was monitoring, but had no ability to see or shoot in other directions without exposing himself. His withdrawal options were minimal. If Germans discovered the hide and assaulted it, he would likely die before he could extract himself from the confined space. The position violated every principle of tactical positioning that Army doctrine emphasized, but it offered one overwhelming advantage that Dalton believed outweighed all limitations. It was completely invisible to anyone not literally standing directly on top of it. German patrols could pass within feet without detection. Enemy soldiers could use the area around the hide as an assembly point or rest area, never realizing an American observer was recording their positions, strength, and movements. In an environment where American elevated positions were being systematically identified and eliminated, invisibility had tactical value that exceeded all other considerations. December 16th, 06:03 hours. First light begins penetrating the forest canopy. Not true dawn, but the gradual transition from absolute darkness to dim gray visibility. Dalton, lying motionless in his ground hide for over an hour, begins to see shapes resolving from shadows. His position, occupied since 0500 hours, is already paying dividends in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. The extreme cold that makes above-ground positions nearly unbearable is moderated by earth insulation. The forest floor debris covering him provides additional thermal protection, while his exhale breath, vented through a concealed breathing tube, dissipates without creating the visible vapor clouds that betray elevated observers in cold weather. He's uncomfortable, the confined space and prone position creating muscle tension and circulation problems, but he's warmer and better concealed than any observer in a tree stand. More importantly, he's positioned along a route that German forces have used repeatedly for infiltration, a narrow game trail that provides covered approach toward American positions. Standard doctrine says observers should position where they can see maximum terrain. Dalton positioned where Germans actually move, accepting limited visibility in exchange for higher probability of observing actual enemy activity. At 0614 hours movement, Dalton catches it through the carefully constructed firing port in his overhead concealment, a gap perhaps 4 inches wide that provides a restricted but functional view of the approach route. 3 German soldiers are moving down the trail with the careful speed of experienced infantry operating in hostile territory. They're wearing winter camouflage, carrying STG-44 assault rifles, moving with tactical discipline that suggests veteran troops rather than recent replacements. They're approximately 60 yards from Dalton's position, close enough for reliable engagement, but still at range where reaction time provides options. Dalton doesn't move, doesn't adjust position, doesn't do anything that might create motion detectable in peripheral vision. He simply watches, controlling his breathing, allowing the Germans to approach. They're scanning their environment the way trained infantry should, checking tree leans and elevated positions, watching for the visual signatures that indicate American observers. But they're not looking down. Their attention is focused at eye level and above, exactly where doctrine teaches them threats will be. They walk past Dalton's hide at approximately 40 feet distance, close enough that he can hear their quiet conversation in German, close enough that he could probably throw a rock and hit them. They have no idea an American soldier is lying beneath the forest floor they're walking on, recording their presence and reporting their movements. Dalton watches them disappear down the trail, then carefully keys a radio concealed in his hide, transmitting a brief contact report to battalion headquarters. 3 enemy infantry moving west on Trail Junction 7. Probable scouts for larger element. Time 0614. Battalion acknowledges. Request continued observation. Dalton settles back into motionless waiting. Over the next 90 minutes, German activity along the trail increases dramatically. Small groups, typically 3 to 5 soldiers, move past Dalton's hide at intervals averaging 12 to 15 minutes. They're reconnaissance elements, scouting American positions in preparation for the massive offensive that will explode across the Ardennes in a few hours. Dalton reports each contact, building a detailed picture of German strength and movement patterns that intelligence officers at battalion are assembling into operational assessments. By 0800 hours, he's reported 17 separate German scouting parties totaling approximately 70 soldiers. Intelligence that's allowing American commanders to recognize something significant is developing. But Dalton hasn't fired a shot. His orders are to observe and report, to provide early warning without compromising his position by engaging targets. The tactical calculation is clear. One hidden observer providing real-time intelligence about German movements is more valuable than a few enemy casualties purchased at the cost of revealing the observation post location. Dalton understands the logic, but it's psychologically difficult to watch enemy soldiers pass so close without engaging, to remain passive while targets present themselves. At 0830 hours, the tactical situation changes. German artillery begins hitting American positions with devastating accuracy, targeting command posts, supply dumps, and communication nodes with fire that's clearly guided by detailed intelligence. The opening bombardment of Operation Wacht am Rhein has begun, and it's immediately apparent that American positions are badly compromised. Within minutes, radio traffic becomes chaotic as units report being under heavy fire, casualties mounting, communications disrupted. Dalton, isolated in his forward hide, receives a brief transmission from battalion that changes his mission parameters. All observers authorized to engage targets of opportunity. German offensive in progress. Maximum disruption priority. The transmission ends abruptly, suggesting battalion headquarters is under fire and probably being evacuated. Dalton is suddenly operating independently. His ground hide no longer a passive observation post, but an active fighting position deep inside what's rapidly becoming German-controlled territory. The Germans are advancing in force, and he's positioned directly along one of their primary approach routes with perfect concealment, and Americans falling back on all sides. The tactical math is simple and terrifying. He can stay hidden and survive, or he can engage and potentially disrupt German operations while almost certainly getting killed in the process. Dalton makes his decision in the seconds it takes to acquire his first target. A German squad. 9 soldiers moving in tactical formation down the trail. Advanced elements of the massive offensive pushing west. They're moving with confidence now, no longer scouting cautiously, but advancing aggressively into what they believe is broken American resistance. The lead soldier is approximately 70 yards from Dalton's position when he fires his first shot. The Springfield's report is sharp and loud in the confined space of the ground hide. The muzzle blast channel forward to a firing port rather than dispersing omnidirectionally. The German soldier drops instantly, killed by a shot he never saw coming from position he walked past minutes earlier. The squad reacts exactly as trained, immediately seeking cover and scanning for the shooter. They're looking at tree leans, searching elevated positions, try to identify muzzle flash location based on sound propagation. They're not looking at the forest floor 20 yards to their left where Dalton is already acquiring his second target. He fires again, dropping a German soldier who's taken cover behind a tree that provides excellent protection from threats ahead and above, but none from the ground-level angle Dalton is shooting from. The squad is now in full confusion. They're taking accurate rifle fire from a position they cannot identify, losing men to a threat their training and experience don't account for. Dalton fires 4 more times in rapid succession, working the Springfield's bolt action with mechanical efficiency, selecting targets based on threat assessment and tactical positioning. He kills 3 more Germans and wounds another before the survivors break and retreat back down the trail, leaving 5 dead and dragging 2 wounded with them. Total elapsed time from first shot to last, approximately 45 seconds. Dalton immediately begins camouflage restoration, carefully repositing the overhead concealment that shifted slightly during firing, brushing away brass casings, doing everything possible to reestablish the hide's invisibility before additional German forces arrive. He knows the sounds of firing will draw attention, that Germans will investigate the area where their patrol was ambushed. His only chance of survival is remaining undetected when they come looking. The ground hide's design, which seemed like a death trap to officers who rejected the proposal, now becomes a salvation. An elevated sniper position would be identified quickly through backtracking bullet trajectories and sound analysis. But Dalton's ground-level fire came from such an unexpected angle that German soldiers investigating the ambush site don't know where to look. They search tree leans, check rooftops of destroyed farmhouse 200 yards distant, even investigate a rock outcropping that might conceal a sniper. But they walk past and around Dalton's hide multiple times without recognizing it as anything other than forest floor. He lies motionless while German soldiers stand literally feet away discussing possibilities in German. He partially understands from language training. They conclude the American sniper must have withdrawn, that the firing position was temporary rather than fixed. They mark the area as dangerous but move on, resuming their advance. Dalton has killed 5 enemy soldiers, disrupted a German advance element, and remained completely undetected. The ground hide works exactly as he predicted it would. Over the following 6 hours, Dalton engages German forces 8 more times from his concealed position. The pattern repeats with variations. German units move down the trail. Dalton engages from an angle and position they don't anticipate. He inflicts casualties and then disappears back into complete concealment before survivors can identify his location. He's not operating as a traditional sniper, selecting high-value targets for long-range precision fire. He's functioning as a mobile ambush position that isn't actually mobile, a fixed kill zone that enemies can't identify or avoid because they don't know it exists. His fields of fire are limited, his escape options non-existent, his vulnerability to discovery absolute if anyone thinks to check the forest floor systematically. But the psychological impact of his attacks compounds their tactical effect. German forces moving through the sector begin reporting an American sniper who shoots from impossible positions, who seems to appear and disappear without logical pattern, who kills soldiers while remaining completely invisible. Units start avoiding the trail Dalton is covering, taking longer routes through difficult terrain to bypass what they perceive as a heavily defended position. Command elements waste time and resources trying to identify and eliminate a threat they can't locate. The single soldier in a ground hide is creating tactical disruption disproportionate to his actual combat power. By mid-afternoon, Dalton has fired 43 rounds, scoring kills on 13 German soldiers and probable wounds on at least 7 more. His ammunition is running critically low, his water exhausted, his physical condition deteriorating from hours of immobility in the confined hide. But he's still operational and still undetected, still reporting German movements when radio conditions permit, still engaging targets when they present themselves. He's also aware that American lines have collapsed across wide sectors, that his battalion is probably withdrawn miles to the rear, that he's isolated deep behind German lines with no realistic prospect of extraction. The ground hide that protected him so effectively is now also his trap. He can't withdraw during daylight without exposing himself to German forces that are everywhere around his position. He needs to stay hidden until darkness provides cover for movement, then attempt infiltration back to American lines through German-controlled territory. The mathematics of survival aren't favorable, but they're not impossible either. He spent his entire life moving through forests without being detected. The Ardennes is dense enough to provide concealment if he's patient and careful. At 1,640 hours, opportunity presents itself in unexpected form. A German officer, identifiable by uniform and bearing, establishes a temporary command post approximately 90 yards from Dalton's hide. He's coordinating multiple units, directing traffic, making decisions about axis of advance and objective priorities. He's surrounded by staff personnel and security elements, perhaps 15 soldiers in total, positioned in what should be a completely secure rear area miles behind the advancing front line. They have no reason to expect American presence. They're operating openly, consulting maps, using radios without concern for exposure. The officer is a high-value target, the kind that can justify significant risk because his death will disrupt German operations at organizational rather than just tactical level. But engaging him means revealing position to a large German element in broad daylight with no chance of escape if the attack fails to achieve complete surprise. Dalton runs the calculation quickly. If he takes a shot and misses or hits but doesn't kill instantly, the Germans will locate his hide and eliminate him. If he doesn't take the shot, a German officer continues coordinating attacks that are killing American soldiers across multiple sectors. The decision isn't difficult. Dalton settles into firing position, controls his breathing, and takes careful aim. The shot is technically difficult, 90 yards at a target partially obscured by other personnel, requiring precision that accounts for bullet drop and slight crosswind. Dalton squeezes the trigger smoothly. The Springfields report loud, but immediately absorbed by ambient combat noise rolling across the sector. The German officer drops instantly, killed by a shot to the upper chest that probably severed the aorta. The command post erupts in confusion. Soldiers scatter seeking cover. Security elements scan frantically for shooter. Staff officers drop maps and equipment in desperate self-preservation moves. Dalton doesn't fire again. He remains absolutely motionless while Germans search the area, while they call for support and reinforcements, while they evacuate the dead officer and establish security perimeters. They never identify his position. From their perspective, their commander was killed by a precision shot from an unidentified location, possibly from extreme range, possibly from a position that withdrew immediately after firing. The possibility that an American sniper is lying beneath the forest floor 20 yards from where they're standing never occurs to them because nothing in their training or experience suggests such positions exist. Dalton has killed his 14th enemy soldier of the day and disrupted German command structure in his sector, all while remaining invisible in a hide that doctrine says shouldn't work. Darkness finally arrives around 1,730 hours, winter sunset in the Ardennes, coming early and bringing temperatures that drop toward freezing. Dalton begins a careful process of extracting himself from the ground hide he's occupied for over 12 hours. His muscles are cramped, his circulation compromised, his body temperature dangerously low despite the earth insulation. It takes him nearly 15 minutes to emerge from the hide, moving with extreme caution to avoid creating noise or disturbing the overhead concealment in ways that might be visible to German forces still operating in the area. Once clear, he spends another 10 minutes systematically camouflaging the hide's entrance, restoring its appearance to undisturbed forest floor. He's not planning to use the position again. He'll be miles away before dawn if he survives the night, but professional pride demands leaving no evidence of the hide's existence. If German forces discover it, they'll understand the technique and develop countermeasures. Better to let it remain an unexplained tactical mystery. Dalton's infiltration back to American lines takes 7 hours of careful movement through German-controlled territory. He travels slowly, pausing frequently to observe and listen, avoiding trails and roads where German forces are concentrated. He uses every fieldcraft technique his father taught him, moving when ambient noise masks sound, freezing when German patrols pass nearby, navigating by terrain features rather than obvious landmarks. At 0143 hours on December 17th, he crosses into American-held territory, nearly getting shot by nervous sentries who aren't expecting friendly forces to approach from the east. After confirming his identity and unit assignment, he's brought to a hastily established battalion command post where exhausted officers are trying to understand the scope of the German offensive and organize coherent defensive responses. His report, detailing German strength, movement patterns, and the effectiveness of his ground-high position, is received with a mixture of disbelief and desperate interest. Officers who would have court-martialed him for violating doctrine yesterday are now interrogating him about construction techniques and tactical employment because conventional approaches have failed catastrophically. The immediate aftermath of Dalton's one-day operation produces several measurable effects. His intelligence reports about German movements, transmitted before communications collapsed, provided early warning that allowed some American units to establish better defensive positions before being overrun. His engagement with German forces along a key approach route delayed advance elements and forced tactical adjustments that cost the Germans several hours of momentum in a sector where timing was critical. His killing of a German field-grade officer, confirmed through prisoner interrogations over following days, disrupted coordination of attacks that might otherwise have achieved deeper penetration of American lines. It's impossible to quantify exactly how many American casualties were prevented by his actions, but post-battle analysis suggests a single-soldier operation had tactical impact equivalent to a well-positioned machine gun team or mortar section. He'd killed 13 Germans who confirmed direct fire, and at least one to the command post engagement, disrupted multiple German advance elements, and provided critical intelligence, all while operating from a position that doctrine said was tactically worthless. The institutional Army response to Dalton's ground hide technique followed predictable patterns of bureaucratic ambivalence. Field commanders, desperate for any tactical advantage that might slow the German offensive, immediately authorized other scouts and snipers to attempt similar positions. Several ground hides were constructed and occupied over the following weeks, with mixed results. Some proved as effective as Dalton's, providing concealment that allowed observers to operate in German-controlled areas without detection. Others failed, either discovered by German forces and eliminated or proving too restrictive for effective observation and engagement. The technique required specific terrain, careful construction, and operator psychology that could tolerate extreme confinement and isolation. It wasn't universally applicable, but in appropriate circumstances, it provided capabilities that elevated positions couldn't match. By late January, as the German offensive was finally contained and reversed, informal tactical guidance about ground hide construction was circulating through infantry and scout units. But the technique was never formally incorporated into doctrine or training manuals. It remained a field expedient method used by specialists, acknowledged but not officially endorsed. Statistical analysis of ground hide employment during the Battle of the Bulge provides limited but suggestive data. Approximately 37 ground hides were documented as being constructed and occupied by American forces between mid-December 1944 and late January 1945. These positions achieved survival rates significantly higher than elevated observation posts, with approximately 73% of ground hide operators surviving their missions compared to 41% survival rates for operators in conventional elevated positions. The improved survival reflected ground hide's superior concealment, which made them less likely to be identified and targeted by German forces. However, ground hides also showed lower enemy casualty production and more restricted observation coverage compared to elevated positions when those positions weren't under direct attack. The technique was demonstrably more survivable but operationally more limited, useful for specific tactical scenarios rather than general application. This nuanced assessment, recognizing both advantages and limitations, represented mature institutional understanding that developed after initial desperate adoption during the crisis. Robert Dalton survived the war, returning to New York in late 1945 with Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and reputation as one of the most effective scouts in his division. He was offered opportunities to stay in service and help develop scout training programs incorporating lessons learned from European combat, but declined. He'd seen enough of military bureaucracy to know that innovative techniques would be systematized and formalized in ways that would destroy their effectiveness, that the ground hide tactics that worked because they were unconventional would become useless once they were standardized and predictable. He returned to the Adirondacks, resumed life as a hunting guide and wilderness instructor, and rarely spoke about his wartime experiences except to close friends who'd also served. His children knew he'd done something significant in Belgium, had earned medals and commendations, but the details remained largely private. Dalton had no interest in being celebrated for killing people. What he'd done in the Ardennes was apply skills his father taught him to solve tactical problems the Army couldn't address through standard doctrine. That seemed like complete story to him. For military historians and tactical theorists, Dalton's story represented something more complex and significant. It demonstrated that effective concealment could sometimes substitute for elevated observation, that invisibility had tactical value, exceeding the limitations it imposed, that unconventional approaches could solve problems where doctrine failed. But it also illustrated that innovative techniques worked precisely because they were unexpected and unusual, that their effectiveness degraded as they became known and opponents developed countermeasures. The ground hide technique Dalton pioneered was extraordinarily effective in December 1944 because German forces had no reason to anticipate or search for ground-level threats. By 1945, as German intelligence became aware of the technique through captured documents and prisoner interrogations, effectiveness declined as German forces began checking forest floors more systematically. Innovation provides temporary advantage that evaporates as knowledge spreads. The most valuable innovations are those that can be modified and adapted faster than opponents can develop counters, creating ongoing tactical evolution rather than single-use techniques. Modern military forces continue to study and occasionally employ ground-hide techniques for specialized reconnaissance and surveillance missions. Special operations units operating in denied territory sometimes use Earth-integrated concealment positions for long-duration observation missions, where detection means mission failure or operator death. These modern applications benefit from technological enhancements Dalton lacked. Thermal insulation materials that reduce infrared signature, periscope optics that allow observation without creating direct firing ports, communication systems that enable remote reporting without radio transmissions from the hide itself. But the fundamental principles remain unchanged. Proper ground concealment can provide near invisibility for operators willing to accept severe physical discomfort and operational restrictions. The technique remains specialist employment rather than standard doctrine, useful for specific missions but too limiting for general application. This reflects accurate assessment of capabilities and constraints rather than institutional resistance to innovation. Robert Dalton died in 1994 at age 71. His obituary noting military service and career as wilderness guide, but providing minimal detail about specific wartime contributions. His grandchildren knew him as a patient teacher who could disappear into forests despite bright clothing and make himself invisible through stillness and awareness of how people perceive their environment. The skills that made him effective combat operator, understanding of concealment principles, comfort with isolation and discomfort, willingness to question established approaches. These remain consistent throughout his life. The war hadn't created those capabilities. It provided context where they became tactically significant rather than recreational skills. James Dalton solved tactical problems by applying unconventional thinking to conventional challenges, accepting risk and discomfort that others avoided, and executing ideas without waiting for institutional permission. That approach saved his life, killed 18 enemy soldiers, and provided intelligence that helped defend against one of Germany's final major offensives. The ground-hide technique he pioneered remains in specialized use 8 decades later, modified and enhanced but fundamentally recognizable. Sometimes the best innovations come from questioning why things must be done certain ways, and asking what becomes possible if we ignore those assumptions entirely.